She walked into the courtroom expecting justice, but instead she was met with violence. Before the eyes of the judge, the jury, and a room full of strangers, the very officers sworn to uphold the law struck her across the face. Gasps filled the air, but no one moved to help. In that moment, humiliation and power collided, yet what happened next left everyone stunned. Seconds later, she did something no one thought possible. How does a victim of racism rise to command the very seat of power meant to silence her? She was not born into privilege, nor did she ever expect the world to hand her anything. Her name was Amara Johnson, a young black woman in her late 20s carrying a quiet strength that many mistook for silence. She lived with her mother in a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city, where cracked sidewalks told stories of generations forgotten by policymakers and leaders. Yet for Amara, this place wasn't just broken concrete and peeling paint. It was home, alive with voices, laughter, and a determination to rise above limits set by others. Each morning began the same. Amara would rise before dawn, the faint hum of traffic outside mixing with the smell of her mother's coffee brewing in the small kitchen. She worked long shifts as a paralegal, her dream being to one day sit for the bar exam and become a defense attorney. It wasn't just ambition, it was purpose. She wanted to fight for people who had no one to fight for them, to stand where justice often failed to stand. Every document she typed, every late night she spent reviewing legal cases, was a step closer to that dream. Her mother, Evelyn, carried the pride of a woman who had weathered storms without ever letting them drown her. Evelyn had been a teacher for 3 decades, shaping young minds even when the system failed to provide her with the resources she deserved. She often reminded Amara, "They will try to box you in because of the color of your skin. But remember, you are the one who decides where the walls go." Those words clung to Amara like armor, especially when the world revealed how little it expected of her. Despite her resilience, the signs of racism were always near, hidden in the corners of everyday life. At the law firm where she worked, colleagues smiled at her but often looked past her. Her ideas in meetings were dismissed until echoed by someone else. When she walked into courtrooms to file paperwork, security guards checked her ID with suspicion, as though her very presence in a space of law was questionable. It was subtle, sometimes invisible to outsiders, but to Amara, it was a steady hum of exclusion that never seemed to quiet down. Still, she pressed forward. She carried herself with dignity, knowing that giving in to bitterness meant letting others define her story. She found joy in the small things, weekend dinners with her mother, helping her niece with homework, or walking through the local park where children played freely, unaware of the barriers waiting for them in adulthood. For Amara, these moments were proof that life was bigger than prejudice, even if prejudice always lingered in the background. But some shadows hinted at the conflict to come. A month before the incident that would change her life forever, Amara witnessed something in the courthouse that unsettled her. A young black man had been brought in for a minor charge, his wrists bound in cuffs that seemed unnecessary for his offense. She watched as officers treated him with a sharpness they didn't show others. When his public defender spoke, the judge barely lifted his eyes, brushing past the case with a dismissive tone. Amara stood silently at the back, her hands tightening around the files she carried. She thought of her own dreams of becoming a lawyer, of standing in front of judges like this, and wondered, would my voice matter, or would it be drowned out before I even spoke? The courthouse was supposed to be a place of order, where truth was weighed and justice decided. But to Amara, it often felt like a theater, where roles were pre-assigned and outcomes predictable. And though she didn't know it then, the same walls that watched her that day would soon bear witness to something far more explosive. Something that would expose not just the system's flaws, but the raw violence hiding beneath its polished surface. For now, she returned home, tired but hopeful, believing that perseverance could bend the arc of her life toward something better. What she could not foresee was how quickly that arc would be broken, and how her own body and spirit would be tested in front of a crowd that expected her to bow her head. The weeks that followed brought both routine and restlessness. Amara's days at the law firm blurred into long hours of reading case files, drafting motions, and running errands between offices. She had learned to creep in a world that rarely noticed her effort, but that quietness was never submission. It was patience. She believed that if she kept pushing, kept building her knowledge, one day she would no longer be the one filing documents at the courthouse desk. She would be the one arguing at the front, forcing those in power to listen. But there were moments when even her patience cracked. One morning, she arrived early at the courthouse to deliver briefs. As she passed through security, the officer waved through a white intern without a glance, yet stopped Amara with a curt tone. He demanded her ID, inspected her bag twice, and asked why she was there. "I work for Harrison Reed," she said, trying to steady her voice. The officer's eyebrow lifted, as if the idea of her belonging to a respected law firm was somehow amusing. She smiled politely, but inside she burned. She didn't tell her mother about these moments. Why add weight to the shoulders of a woman who had already carried so much? Instead, Amara took them herself, stacking each incident like bricks on her back. She told herself it was temporary, that once she became an attorney, people would have no choice but to respect her. Yet the voice of doubt sometimes whispered otherwise. What if no title, no achievement, could ever erase the prejudice written on your skin? Outside of work, life offered both solace and a reminder. The neighborhood where Amara lived was tight-knit, filled with neighbors who looked out for one another. Children darted through the streets with basketballs, and families gathered on stoops to share stories in the fading light. But even there, signs of systemic neglect were plain: underfunded schools, crumbling infrastructure, and few opportunities beyond low-paying jobs. Amara felt the weight of these conditions pressing not just on her, but on every young face she saw in the neighborhood. It fueled her determination, but also deepened her unease. On Sundays, she attended church with her mother. The hymns echoed with hope, but the whispered conversations afterward often carried another tone. Stories of unfair treatment at work, of landlords refusing repairs, of traffic stops that turned threatening. These were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a larger fabric, woven so tightly that it sometimes seemed impossible to pull them apart. Amara listened, her heart heavy, knowing her own encounters were just one piece of the same pattern. Then came the day that etched itself into her memory like a warning. She was assigned to assist in preparing documents for a high-profile case. When she entered the judge's chambers to deliver the files, she noticed how the clerks barely acknowledged her presence. She placed the stack neatly on the desk. But as she turned to leave, she overheard one of them mutter, "Surprised they trust her with this." The words were not directed at her, but they pierced her all the same. She froze for a second, then walked out with her head held high, her steps steady even as her stomach twisted. Moments like this carved into her spirit. They were not loud, not explosive, but they were constant, like drops of water wearing down stone. Each slight carried the same message: you do not belong here. Yet Amara refused to surrender. She poured herself deeper into her studies at night, reviewing past cases until her eyes blurred, determined to prove, if not to them, then at least to herself, that she had earned her place. But beneath that determination, something darker simmered. She began to notice the fragility of the justice system she once revered. Too often, she watched cases where the scales seemed tilted before arguments even began. Defendants who looked like her were handled harshly, while others walked away with leniency. She could see it in the judge's eyes, in the smirks of certain officers, in the hurried words of overworked public defenders. It wasn't just bias, it was a system built on imbalance. At home, her mother noticed the change. Evelyn would sometimes find Amara staring out the window long after dinner, her books untouched. "You're carrying too much," her mother would say gently. Amara would smile, insisting she was fine, but inside she was wrestling with questions she couldn't yet answer. How long could one endure the weight of a system that seemed determined to crush them? How much patience could justice demand before silence became complicity? These were the questions echoing in her mind on the morning of the incident. She had entered the courthouse with the duplicate files she had carried 100 times before, expecting another routine day. But routine has a way of shattering without warning. She didn't know that within those walls, the quiet humiliations she had endured for years would erupt into open violence. She didn't realize that every whispered slight, every skeptical glance, every dismissive gesture had been leading to this moment. She only knew that as she walked through the courthouse doors that morning, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, the walls more suffocating. She could not name it, but she felt it deep in her chest. Change was coming, and it would not be gentle. The courthouse always carried an air of cold formality, but on that particular day, it didn't feel amicable. Amara arrived early, her hands clutching a file of motions prepared overnight. She had walked through those doors countless times. Yet the weight in her chest told her this day would not be ordinary. At security, she faced the same officer who once scrutinized her badge as though it were counterfeit. Today his stare lingered longer, his voice sharper. "Empty your bag again." She did as told, her cheeks burning as others in line shuffled impatiently behind her. The officer smirked as if the inconvenience was a punishment designed solely for her. She gathered her things quietly, but the humiliation clung like a second skin. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was worse. She was scheduled to assist a senior attorney in presenting background research, a rare chance to show her skills in front of a judge. She had prepared meticulously, spending hours ensuring every citation was perfect. But as she took her seat at the firm's table, whispers reached her ears. A clerk muttered something under his breath, and she caught the words out of place. The hearing began, and Amara felt her pulse quicken when the attorney called her forward to present. She rose with steady hands, but the judge's expression was unreadable, his eyes narrowing as if weighing not her words, but her presence. Before she could finish her explanation, the judge interrupted, his tone sharp. "That will be enough. I'll hear from counsel directly." The words cut deep. It wasn't a correction of content, but a dismissal of existence. She sat down slowly, her body stiff, her heart pounding with rage she dared not show. The attorney beside her whispered, "Don't take it personally." But she knew better. This wasn't about her performance. It was about who she was. As the days went on, the hostility only deepened. Minor incidents piled into something undeniable. Files she submitted went missing, only to reappear hours later in the wrong pile. She overheard laughter when she walked by, followed by sudden silence. In the courthouse cafeteria, a group of officers sat at the following table, their voices deliberately loud. "Some people don't know their place," one said, his eyes flicking toward her. The others chuckled, sipping their coffee with smug grins. Amara learned to swallow her anger, but it began to eat at her. She questioned whether her dream of becoming an attorney was worth walking daily through corridors that seemed determined to break her spirit. Each night she returned home exhausted, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long before the dam of her patience would shatter. Then came the case that would change everything. A young black mother was facing charges for resisting arrest, though the details were murky. Amara studied the file, her stomach twisting at the contradictions. Witness accounts differed, and body cam footage mysteriously had technical issues during the most critical moments. Still, the prosecution moved forward confidently, as though conviction was inevitable. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom filled quickly. Reporters hovered near the back, sensing controversy. Amara was there to assist again, but her eyes remained fixed on the woman seated at the defendant's table. She saw herself in her. The same tired eyes, the same quiet resilience. And when the officers who had arrested the woman entered, Amara felt an unease crawl up her spine. Their smirks told her they believed they owned the room. As testimony began, the bias was impossible to ignore. The prosecutor's questions painted the woman as defiant, ungrateful, and dangerous. The defense struggled to push back, but the judge's interruptions weakened their case at every turn. Each objection was brushed aside, each point dismissed. The air felt heavy with injustice, suffocating everyone except those who benefited from it. Amara's fists clenched under the table. Every word, every sneer, every nod from the bench chipped away at her restraint. She wanted to scream, to expose the charade for what it was. But she sat silently, the weight of her role binding her. She knew one misstep could end her career before it even began. And then, during cross-examination, the moment came that would tip the scales. One officer's testimony contradicted the official report, but instead of pressing further, the judge cut off the questioning and ruled the testimony sufficient. The defense attorney sat stunned, his mouth slightly open but powerless to fight the decision. Amara's heart thundered. She had studied every detail of the file, and she knew the officer's words were lies. Lies bold enough to rewrite a woman's future. Lies that the court had just swallowed whole. She wanted to stand, to speak, to demand truth, but her body remained frozen. The trial adjourned for the day, leaving the woman's fate dangling like a noose. Amara left the courtroom shaken, the corridors spinning around her. She knew the system was flawed, but she hadn't expected it to be so brazen, so shamelessly tilted. That night she sat at her desk, staring at the case notes long after midnight. Her mother knocked gently, bringing tea, but Amara barely noticed. Her thoughts swirled with anger, grief, and determination. She whispered to herself, "If they can silence her, they can silence anyone." She didn't yet know that the storm had only begun. What she had witnessed was just the opening act. The real blow, the one that would push her past the edge, was waiting only days away. 2 days later, Amara returned to the courthouse with the same file pressed tightly to her chest. She hadn't slept much. The lies she'd heard echoed in her head like a drumbeat. She told herself today would be different, that perhaps the defense would regain ground. But deep down, she feared the outcome had already been written. The security checkpoint was unusually tense. The officer who once smirked at her now searched her bag with exaggerated slowness, pulling out pens and notebooks as if they were contraband. Behind her, the line grew restless, sighs filling the air. Amara stood still, cheeks flushed, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. He finally waved her through, his lips curling into a grin that felt more like a threat than a smile. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere simmered with anticipation. The defendant sat rigid, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Amara caught her gaze for a fleeting second, offering a slight, steady nod. It wasn't much, but it was all she could give, a silent promise that she believed her. The proceedings began. Witnesses were called, evidence displayed, arguments exchanged. But beneath the surface, the imbalance was undeniable. The prosecution moved with confidence, their words dripping with certainty. The defense stumbled, cut off at every turn by the judge's impatience. Each objection was met with a dismissive wave as though fairness was an inconvenience. Then came the breaking point. During a recess, 2 officers approached the defendant to escort her back to holding. She rose slowly, her wrists cuffed, her dignity intact despite the chains. But as they guided her toward the door, one officer muttered something under his breath. Amara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the woman's face tighten in pain. A second later, the officer shoved her forward roughly, sending her stumbling. The courtroom gasped. The judge remained silent. The attorneys looked away. No one moved. Attorneys looked away. No one moved. And then it happened. With the entire courtroom watching, the officer raised his hand and slapped the woman across the face. The crack of skin against skin echoed in the chamber, louder than any gavel. The defendant reeled, her knees buckling, but she refused to fall. Her eyes glistened with tears, not of weakness but of defiance. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Amara's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Every humiliation, every dismissal, every injustice she had endured surged inside her like fire. She looked around the courtroom, at the judge's impassive face, at the smirking officers, at the silent audience, and felt something inside her snap. The recess ended, and as people shuffled back to their places, Amara's mind raced. She could not let this stand. She could not unsee what she had just witnessed. The silence of authority was complicity, and complicity was something she could no longer bear. When the judge returned and the room settled, Amara noticed something strange. For the first time, the judge hesitated before taking his seat. Papers shuffled, clerks exchanged uneasy glances, and the defendant sat trembling with a bruise forming on her cheek. The judge cleared his throat, but before he could speak, the room erupted into whispers. Amara rose from her chair slowly, her legs trembling but steady. Her eyes locked on the bench, on the seat that symbolized power and control. A thought flashed through her mind, terrifying and liberating all at once. If they will not deliver justice, I will. She moved toward the front of the courtroom, each step heavy with the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. Whispers grew louder, gasps echoing as people realized what she was doing. The officers shifted uneasily, uncertain of whether to intervene. The judge froze, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Amara reached the steps of the bench, her hands trembling as she placed the file on the desk. And then, with the entire courtroom holding its breath, she turned and lowered herself into the judge's seat. The air cracked with disbelief. For one impossible second, the entire room seemed suspended in silence, staring at a woman who had transformed from victim to authority in a single act. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow, but her gaze was steady. She had done the unthinkable, and with that, the stage was set. The confrontation between injustice and resistance was no longer brewing. It had erupted, and there would be no turning back. The courtroom was no longer silent. It vibrated with whispers, gasps, and disbelief. Amara sat in the judge's chair, a place no one ever imagined she would occupy. For a moment, the entire system seemed paralyzed. The officers shifted uncertainly, the lawyers froze mid-motion, and the judge himself looked more like a powerless bystander than the figure of authority he was supposed to be. Amara's hands trembled on the wooden arms of the chair. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, the thundering of her heartbeat in her ears. But for the first time, the fear wasn't enough to hold her down. It was swallowed up by something sharper, fiercer, the kind of clarity born only in moments of desperation. Her voice broke the silence. This seat does not belong to those who silence the truth. This seat belongs to justice. The room erupted. Some gasped in shock. Others cheered under their breath, thrilled by the audacity of her defiance. But the officers were not amused. Two of them started forward, their boots echoing against the polished floor. Their eyes narrowed, their jaws clenched. The same hands that had slapped a woman moments ago now itched for another act of force. "Step down," one barked, his voice slicing through the tension. Amara did not move. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes burning into the faces of everyone present. "You all saw what happened here," she said, her voice rising. "You saw a woman in chains slapped in front of the law. And you said nothing. You did nothing. If this court cannot uphold justice, then it is nothing more than theater." The officers reached the steps to the bench. The audience held its breath, and then the defendant, bruised but unbroken, stood. Her chains rattled as she raised her head high. "She's right," the woman said, her voice shaking but loud enough to pierce the silence. "If they can slap me here in front of you all, imagine what they do when no one is watching." The words landed like thunder. The gallery stirred. Murmurs swelled into angry voices, questions, and accusations. People were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses, and the burden of what they had seen was suddenly too heavy to ignore. The judge slammed his gavel, desperate to regain control. "Order! Order in the court!" he barked, his face red with fury. But his words carried no weight anymore. His gavel sounded hollow against the rising tide of unrest. One officer grabbed Amara's arm, yanking her upward. She cried out, the sound raw and furious, but she didn't let go of the chair. "This is what they do," she shouted, her voice cracking. "This is the hand of racism. This is the face of injustice." Another officer joined, pulling harder, their grip bruising her skin. The crowd erupted, some shouting for them to stop, others demanding accountability. Phones were lifted, recording every second. The truth, once hidden in shadows, was now burning under the light of cameras and eyes that refused to look away. The judge shouted again, but his authority was unraveling like frayed cloth. The more he demanded silence, the louder the voices grew. And then, in the chaos, Amara did the unthinkable. With every ounce of strength left in her, she ripped her arm free, slamming her fist against the bench. The crack echoed like a gunshot. She rose to her feet, towering over the courtroom, her chest heaving, her eyes aflame with unyielding fire. "You cannot silence us all," she roared. "You cannot bury the truth forever. Today, the world sees you." The gallery erupted into thunderous applause, cheers, and shouts of solidarity. It was no longer a courtroom. It was an uprising. The officers hesitated, caught between orders and the undeniable truth that their violence had been exposed. The defendant, tears streaming down her face, raised her cuffed hands high, no longer in shame but in defiance. "We are not afraid anymore," she cried. At that moment, the power shifted. The judge's gavel was useless. The officers' badges, their uniforms, their weapons, all looked suddenly small, fragile, against the raw force of truth and unity filling the room. One officer lunged again, but this time dozens of voices shouted at once. "Stop!" The cameras kept rolling. The world would see everything. Amara turned toward the crowd, her voice breaking but resolute. "This is not just my fight. This is not just her fight. This is our fight, and it will not end here." The officers froze, caught in a storm bigger than their fists. The gallery surged with energy, people standing, chanting, refusing to be silenced. The courthouse, once a place where injustice was quietly dressed as law, had become the stage of its exposure. The judge's face was pale now, his gavel resting uselessly in his hand. For the first time, he looked small, as though the throne he sat upon had crumbled beneath him. Amara's chest rose and fell in sharp breaths. Every muscle in her body shook from adrenaline, from fear, from fury, but also from a strange, powerful sense of freedom. She had done what no one thought possible. She had dragged racism into the light, forced the system to look at itself in the mirror. But just as the cheering swelled to its peak, just as hope filled the air, a cold voice cut through it all. "Arrest her." The command came not from the judge, but from the chief officer standing in the back, a towering figure whose eyes gleamed with malice. He stepped forward slowly, his presence chilling the room. "Take her down," he ordered. The gallery gasped. The officers, hesitant moments ago, now seemed to find new resolve under the weight of his command. They advanced toward Amara, their hands reaching once more. Amara's heart pounded. Her body ached. But she did not step back. She squared her shoulders, meeting their gaze head-on. She knew what was coming. The cold grip of chains, the crushing weight of retaliation, and yet she smiled, because even if they dragged her away, the world had already seen. The cameras had already captured it. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. The officers closed in. The crowd shouted, some trying to push forward, others recording every second. The defendant's voice rang out, desperate and strong. "Don't let them take her!" Hands reached for Amara. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the storm crash around her. And then she opened them again, fire blazing, her voice steady and unbroken. "You can take me," she said, her voice carrying like a bell. "But you cannot take justice." The room shook with the roar of voices. The officers lunged, and the screen cut to black. The courtroom walls still echoed with the roar of voices long after Amara was dragged away. Her chair sat empty, but it no longer looked like a throne of power. It looked broken, stripped of authority, haunted by the memory of what had happened there. The world had shifted in those moments, and nothing would ever return to silence again. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew by the hour. Word spread like fire. The videos recorded on trembling hands had already hit the internet before Amara's wrists were even shackled again. Millions watched, shared, and raged. They saw the slap. They saw the struggle. They saw the courage of a woman who refused to bow to fear, and who refused to bow to fear. And for the first time, the courtroom's injustice wasn't hidden behind legal jargon or locked doors. It was public, undeniable, seared into the conscience of a nation. Amara sat in a holding cell that night, her body aching from bruises, her spirit heavy with exhaustion. The steel bars pressed cold against her back as she closed her eyes. Doubt whispered in the dark corners of her mind. What if nothing changes? What if all of this was for nothing? But then, through the narrow window, she heard them. Voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, chanting her name. "Amara! Amara! Amara!" They hadn't gone home. They were still there, holding candles, holding signs, holding hope. And she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, the headlines screamed across every newspaper, every screen. "Black woman slapped in courtroom, then took the judge's seat." Outrage erupts over racist court incident. Calls for accountability grow after viral video. Politicians scrambled to respond. Activists called for reforms. Civil rights leaders demanded justice, not just for Amara, but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced without witnesses, without cameras, without proof. The judge who once barked for order now faced an investigation. The officers, once shielded by badges, were suspended pending review. And the defendant, the woman who had been slapped, was finally granted the dignity of being heard. Her charges, once heavy with prejudice, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. But Amara, she became something more than she ever expected. She was no longer just a paralegal, no longer just a woman trying to make her way in a system stacked against her. She had become a symbol, a reminder that silence could be broken, that fear could be defied, that even in the darkest rooms, truth could find a way to shine. Still, the cost was heavy. Amara returned home days later, released on bail, her face pale with exhaustion. Her family clung to her, tears soaking into her shirt. But behind their relief there was fear. Fear of retaliation, of threats, of the system's vengeance. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Half messages of support, half warnings and hate. Some called her a hero. Others called her a criminal. But Amara knew the truth. She was both. A hero to those who had been waiting for someone to stand. A criminal in the eyes of those desperate to protect their power. And in that tension, she found her strength. She began speaking at rallies, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told her story again and again, not for fame, not for glory, but because it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced. Everyone who had been slapped, mocked, dismissed, or ignored. Every retelling was a wound reopened. But it was also a scar shared. The defendant, the woman whose humiliation had sparked it all, became Amara's closest ally. They stood side by side at protests, their linked hands raised in defiance. What began as a slap meant to silence became a bond unbreakable, a testament to resilience. Together, they reminded the world that racism was not an abstract issue debated in quiet halls. It was here, raw and violent in the heart of the so-called justice system. And slowly, change began. Courtrooms across the country adopted stricter policies on officer conduct. Judges faced new levels of scrutiny. The public, once distant from the struggles hidden in legal walls, paid attention in ways they hadn't before. The slap had not just struck one woman, it had struck the conscience of a nation. But Amara carried her own scars. She still woke some nights to the memory of hands gripping her arms, dragging her down. She still flinched at sudden movements, still felt the phantom sting of humiliation. Courage did not erase trauma. It simply gave it meaning. One evening, months later, she stood outside the courthouse again. The crowds had thinned. The cameras were gone. The headlines had moved on. But Amara stood there quietly, staring up at the building that had once tried to crush her spirit. It was the same stone, the same windows, the same doors. But to her, it no longer looked invincible, because she knew something the system could never unlearn. People had seen. People had felt. And once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. She turned away, her footsteps steady, her chin high. She wasn't finished, far from it. But she no longer carried the fight alone. And so the story closed not with silence, but with a ripple. A ripple that became a wave that forced the world to look at itself in the mirror and ask, how many times had injustice hidden in plain sight? How many voices had been silenced because no one dared to speak? And if a woman like Amara, bruised and beaten but unbroken, could stand in the seat of power and refuse to bow, then what excuse did anyone else have to stay silent? The courtroom slap was meant to humiliate. Instead, it ignited a revolution, and long after the echoes of that day faded, its impact still burned, in laws rewritten, in voices lifted, in courage awakened, because racism may strike hard. But truth, once spoken, strikes harder. They tried to silence her with a slap. Instead, they gave her a voice the whole world could hear. The question is, when injustice strikes again, will you stay silent, or will you rise? Or will you rise?